So, hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. And today we have another special guest on the show. It's Christopher Trudeau. Hello, Christopher. Welcome.
Hey there. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're the author of Django in Action, which, is interesting. Like, why we have a Django programmer on a Flutter podcast, right? And I think this was also one of your questions. Like, are you sure you're in the right place? Yeah.
I'm happy to talk to anybody about it. Promo the book. It's ad numbers, but yeah, it was one of my first questions. Sure.
Well, the other thing too is I just want to bring up this comment. We got this comment on the show. I guess we spent too much time bantering back and forth. We were talking quite a lot before the show, which is fine. Just we got kind of carried away talking about, of course, politics and everything else. But coming back, you're the author of this book called Django in Action. I reached out to quite a bit of authors at Manning's because I have this special relationship with them. And as I said before, a lot of people online are writing their own back end. There's quite a lot of people who are actually using like something like Firebase or Super Base, maybe other kinds of bases. And there's also quite a lot of people who are using existing frameworks out there, such as something with JavaScript, pick the framework of the week, and Django or Flask. And so I thought Django is a perfect, framework and something we should kind of talk about because, people will probably usually they have some kind of existing website and then they want to add a mobile app to it. So, but before we get into that part, I did want to kind of quickly let you, quickly introduce yourself and talk a little bit about, you know, why are you some kind of authority on Django and who are you? It sounds like you also do your own podcast, so I'll let you also talk about that too. So, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So professionally, I'm a consultant. So I work with organizations. The my marketing people tell me to say fractional CTO because it sounds sexier, I guess. And what that tends to mean is I'm either helping with architectural type stuff or technical process kinds of things like agile, lean, and those kinds of pieces. I've got a fair amount of background in startups and small places and trying to bootstrap kinds of organizations. And in fact, that was how I got into Django. It was about 15 years ago. One of the startups I was at, we were trying to figure out what we should build the website in, and we needed pieces, interactive pieces for the Android and iPhone. And so we ended up picking Django, and that was kind of how I learned it. Between contracts, I do a bit of education stuff. So I have relationships with both real Python and a little bit of stuff on Talk Python as well for courses. And some people might know me. I show up bi-weekly as the permanent guest on the Real Python podcast, where we talk about what's going on in the Python world. And 2 years ago, Manning approached me about adding another voice about Django to the whole wilderness of publication. And I sat down and kind of pounded away at it. And a lot of the ideas that were in there, I kind of first worked out with a course that I had built for Talk Python, which was an intro to Django from there. And I think that's how they approached me. And here we are, got some dead trees with my name on it.
Wow, that's quite a history. I'm not even sure where the heck I even want to start with this. So you said, if I remember what you said before, is that you reached out to Manning. You said Manning reached out to you. I couldn't remember
No,
which
no,
which one was it.
Manning found me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they seem to be able to do that. So you've already had this quite big presence with Django. I would like to know a little bit more about kind of your programming background in terms of like how you got started and how you worked your way over to Django because Django is relatively, I mean, you and me were both not graduated yesterday, right? So I'm sure Django
Yeah.
wasn't your very first framework ever. I was curious what kind of got you onto Django and sticking you around with that because I think you've been around for quite some time in Django, right?
Yeah. I'm an old man, so the programming history is a long story, but I'll save people the whole diatribe. The short, I've been coding since I was 9 or 10 years old. I've got, I don't know, probably a dozen languages under my belt at various times. I was running the dev shop at a medium sized organization that got purchased. And during the handover, we had a lot of spare time, and I had a couple friends who were really into Python, and so I was using that spare time to pick up some Python and solve some problems as I went along. And as I mentioned, the place I ended up after that was a startup, so it was me and two other developers along with the founders. And so we kind of decided we liked Python. We started out as a Python shop, and I'm not. It was long enough ago. I'm not sure how I actually made the decision, but I kind of evaluated the web frameworks that were out there and picked Django. And we built products for that company in that space. A couple startups I was at after that did the same thing. So I've got a bit of coding experience with Python and Django under my belt. And now, because I'm on the consulting side, sometimes I'm using that inside of organizations, and sometimes I'm just still using it to sort of solve my own little personal problems. I'm, my ongoing right now. I'm in the process of revamping my personal website, and it's going to be Django and some HTMX pieces. So yeah, I am still sort of scratching the itch.
Now that a lot of kind of questions came into my mind, right? Python is such a versatile language. Ugh, really need a longer cable. Python's such a versatile language. You could do a lot with it. Obviously, people using a lot with AI and just kind of prototyping things. Why Django, right? Because when I see, at least around me, a lot of projects that I happen to see are mostly looking at Flask because they're mostly
Mhm.
API related. But why continue to work with Django? I mean, it probably has this idea that it has a lot of bloat, right? Because it does give you a lot of features out of the box.
Sure.
Maybe
I, to be honest, one of the answers to that is almost with any developers, almost always inertia, right? When you're trying to build something, it's always easier to build something with what you're familiar with. I'm a fan of both Flask and Fast API. They're decent libraries. One person's bloat is another person's. It's a complete thing that works together and orchestrates well together. So Django includes both the kinds of things that Flask and Fast API do, which are the web interface, the thing that translates a URL into some code that needs to be run. But Django also includes template management so that you can, HTML is very verbose, it's very repetitive. So you want to codify some of those things and get the repetition out of that. And there are other Python libraries out there that do that, but Django has that built in. Likewise, typically at scale, you're going to start having to run into some sort of database, something or other. And again, there are third party libraries in Python for doing that stuff as well, but Django has that built in. And so often what I find when I'm talking to folks about Flask or Fast API is inevitably once they start getting to a problem of a certain size, they have to start adding other third-party libraries and making them all work together. Whereas in the Django case, you've got that from the outset. So you know I- the I tend to use Flask and Fast API when I'm trying to solve very specific problems very, very quickly. If I'm going for anything that I know is going to be a general website, then I tend to go to Django because I know I'm going to need those other pieces and those other backends. There are features in it that are kind of subtle and sort of, yeah, whatever, until you actually start using it. So in particular with the database interface, so the primary, let's say, competitor or alternative for that would be SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy's got a great ORM in it, maps object concepts to your database, same as the Django ORM. But where to me Django becomes really, really helpful there is it also includes a web interface for interfacing to that ORM. So it's ugly. It's horrible looking, very, very practical. I wouldn't put it in front of my customers, but as a back end for admins to be able to muck with things in the database, this is a huge powerhouse. And in fact, at Real Python, all of the CMS backend pieces, because it's the authors who are interacting with it, not the general public, all of that's written in these interfaces. So you can get a full CMS management, CRM management type piece going with very, very little code because of that integration between the web and the database. And if you just go with something like Flask and SQL Alchemy, you don't gain that because those are two separate libraries. And although they work well enough together, they don't integrate closely the way Django does. So, a lot of that, as you say, bloat really becomes this is a solution oriented package. And if you are going to be trying to solve the web problem, including database pieces, which most websites do need something like that, then having it all together is a big advantage.
yeah, I definitely have to agree. Like I see both sides in terms of yes, you do want to slim down thing because the more things you add, the more longer boot time, especially with these not compiled languages. It's fine, it happens, but yeah, you'd be surprised how many times over time and even sometimes relatively quickly, you're like, "Oh, wait, actually, I need this, I need that, I need that," and you end up
Yeah.
kind of like rebuilding, basically Frankensteining something that you could have
Yeah.
had a little bit nicer to begin with. So I don't disagree with that part.
Yeah, and I'm, you know, I'm kind of over the performance thing. There are places where performance is very, very important, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't worry about it, but the web is, for the most part, the vast majority of what you do on the web is trivially parallelizable, right? Like, whether you've got 10 users or 100,000 users, unless you're writing, a game or something where they're interacting with each other, page views are just page views. And we live in an age where just throw another server at it. So, the little bit of, like you say, something like startup time doesn't tend to bother me at scale, until you're at the Netflix scale. Then that's a whole other problem. But very, very few of us actually deal with that. And one of the organizations I was at, we were running, I think it was 40 million views a month or something like that. And honestly, as it went up, all you did was throw two more servers at it, and it was an easy enough way to do it and keeps your architecture relatively simple. So I'm kind of nonplussed about is the boot up time half a second longer? Okay, maybe it is.
Yeah, we have a couple more people kind of coming in. Somebody's waving their hand. This is a fan of yours. And we, of course, we have a guy who was waiting who just states Python slow.
Sure.
Yeah, it's slow, but it can get you moving much faster in terms of development. So it's always this kind of back and forth, like sure, it's runs slow, but then I can develop much more features much more quickly, right?
Yeah, all languages are all languages are trade-offs. I'm very pragmatic about my technology. I'm not. I spend a fair amount of my time in Python, so of course I'm gonna I'll sing its praises. But there are cases where you shouldn't use it, right? My favorite programming teams are those that are trying to figure out how to solve the problem and then pick the programming language that makes the most sense afterwards. Although Python has a slower startup time because it's interpreted, there's been a lot of work. People are working very, very hard on trying to speed it up. So some of that myth of its slowness has gone away. Python also has an advantage, which I'm not sure if non-Python people are aware of. It integrates very, very closely with C. And as a result, there are libraries out there like Pedantic and NumPy that are actually not written in Python, that are core third party libraries for the Python language. And so if you are trying to do certain kinds of things at scale that are computationally expensive, there are often libraries out there that will kick most other libraries' butts easily because they've been optimized. And then you end up getting the best of both worlds because you've got some of the, like you say, sort of the easier to write pieces of Python along with the performance speed that you get out of something like NumPy or Pandas or Polars. So that hybrid I find is very, very effective. Is it a solution for everything? Of course not. There are times where you should just use a compiled language. This day and age, I think those are becoming fewer and further between. But yeah, use the right tool for the job without a doubt.
Yeah, our fan also states that I don't know if I've ever heard this one before, but he's saying that Mark Zuckerberg mentioned that if he had an alternative PHP, he would prefer Python. Interesting. I never heard that, but I also find it kind of weird that people are kind of using that PHP hack to kind of change a little bit how the language works. But in any case, but yeah, what you're saying about the speed improvements, I believe the latest version of Python did. I don't know if it's the latest one, the one before that, that they did a huge push in terms of performance, and they're still working on more. Like removing the GIL is a big one that they keep talking about. It should
Yeah,
be coming
so
up pretty
so
soon.
the last there've been a couple corporate sponsors that have been throwing full-time people at trying to improve the general performance of the language. The last two or three releases have had significant boosts. And then as you mentioned, the removal of the GIL is currently an experimental feature. So what that means is it's not in the base compile. You have to actually turn on a flag to get it. The We've been here before though. And they're very conscious that they don't want things like removal of the GIL to make the rest of the language slow. So over the next two or three versions, they're going to be tinkering with that to try and see if they can to get if it's going to show the promise that they want it to, and if it doesn't, they may not yank it out. For those of your listeners who aren't familiar, Python has a core lock in it to prevent race conditions in memory management. This is known as the GIL, which is the global interpreter lock. And this prevents you from getting certain kinds of speed up in threading environments. And it's one of those things that is both a solution and a big thorn in our side when you're trying to get performance. And so it's an ongoing thing to try to figure out whether or not that it can be pulled out of the language.
Well, now that we talked about the age-old, Python's too slow kind of thing for longer than we should have, I did want to kind of roll back to something you talked about before about the database. It's a web view. Is that's right? That's built into the actual database itself, or did I misunderstand what you said?
Yeah, so there's a part of Django is something called the Django admin. And so let me back up just for a second. So the built into Django is an ORM, which is a mapping engine between class-based code and tables. So if I'm going to, if I have a table about a person with a first name and a last name, I write a class about that in a certain fashion, declaring first name is string, last name is string, date of birth is date, that kind of stuff. And then I run a configuration tool, and the code will map that to the tables in your database. There are also mechanisms so that down the road, if you need to add another field to the person, it'll add the columns. So all that database management, database history, rolling forward, rolling backwards, all that kind of stuff is built into and available as part of Django. The Django admin then sits on top of that with very little extra code. You can declare a page for managing that person. And so then you log in typically with admin credentials, and then you're able to get a full listing of all of the rows in the database that is a person. You can click on any of them, you can edit any of them, you can add people, delete people. So all your standard CRUD stuff for anything you've declared in the database. And it can get quite fancy and complicated, but the simplest version of it really is just two lines of code that basically say, I want a page in the admin for that database object, and you automatically get all of this stuff for free. And to me, that is one of the biggest, most powerful things, because if you're already in that database space, you're getting this configuration management with very, very little extra coding. And it's intuitive from a programmer's perspective. It's not necessarily intuitive from an end user's perspective, because it is architected like something that looks kind of like the database. So I wouldn't use it as a front end for, for the general public. But if you were writing something, to bring this back to your audience, right? If you're writing a back end and your user's front end is on the phone with something like a Flutter app, then you would still be able to get this back end and go in and change accounts, you manage users, manage things that are in the database for those users, and then the front end becomes the phone. So for your admin type people, your back end type people, your call center type people, all of that basically comes almost for free with very little extra code on top of the database code that you were going to have to run afterwards. And to me, it really is one of the strongest arguments for Django. It's the differentiator, because if you Lego brick the other libraries, you're going to have to write something like this yourself. In Django, it's built in. Could be prettier, but sometimes effectiveness is good enough.
So I think if you listen to some of my other podcasts, you may have heard me kind of somewhat bashing Python a bit because I was never a huge fan of it. It but the one thing I definitely really, really loved a lot was that, yeah, you had this interface thing and it was built into it, and it wasn't necessarily crap, like, you could use it. Yeah, sure, it wasn't the best, but for, like, it was just, like, built in, and I think you had to do a little bit
Yeah.
of setup to make it work or, like, to turn it on, but it was like, wow, I could do everything I wanna do basically, and, this makes life so much easier. I think we're actually my first use of Django was when I was still in university. We were building a CMS for the campus website, and I think that
Mhm.
makes sense, right? So the beginning of
Yeah.
Django, my understanding was actually to manage. It was a CMS, right, for a
Yeah, it was a
newspaper.
CMS for a newspaper. Yeah.
Yeah, so, like, this use case made sense, and I remember, like, putting these things together, and I'm like, "Well, how come this UI just came up?" I mean, this was a long, long time ago, and it was just awesome. Like, Rails does not have that. Like, I'm a huge fan of Rails.
Right.
I love Rails. I love Ruby. But the one thing was, like, there was no built-in admin interface, which I wish we had. Don't have it. But yeah, that's so, like, that kind of stuff was fantastic. So, and that can easily help, like you said, with coding, right? If you already have this thing built in, you just need to kind of just do the smaller bits that you need to do in order to make your app do whatever else, and then the admin part that you need to use yourself is good enough to use, like you stated, right?
Yeah, almost every small company that I've worked with that have had to build, web applications, there's almost always some sort of back-end admin thing. If nothing else, just straight out user management, right? Oh, you need to do a password reset? Okay, I got to go in and click that and cause that to happen. And obviously there's mechanisms for doing self-service of that, of, go reset your password, but there's almost always some sort of, call centery, bug support type place, and those tools are basically free because they're just built on top of the database, right? So user management, as an example, it's something that comes with Django. User management really is just a matter of managing username and password tables, and they use the Django admin to manage the users. So you can log into the admin and go in and create new users or do password resets or all that kind of good stuff. And and I find it particularly with small companies that are trying to bootstrap, this is really really powerful, because you don't have to go, like if I'm just trying to get something out there and get people play with it to see whether or not they're interested, I don't have to go and write a full suite of user management tools. They can send me an email and say, I want a new account, and you go create it for them using this back end, and then go, here's your username and password. And eventually you'll get to a place of writing self-serve, but you can concentrate on the core part of your business and see whether or not, the actual thing that's going to make you money is something that's useful. And so, like, being able to have these kinds of tools to manage these back ends can be really 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 powerful, so that you can focus on the parts of your business or your application that are key to your users, and then you can add the other parts as niceness and prettiness afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. But kind of bringing it back into a little more relevant to, the Flutter team, right? So let's say that, you built your web app, it's becoming popular, you've got this need that you got to build this mobile app. Of course, we choose the best framework in the world, Flutter, to make your mobile app. Now you got to connect the two, right? And you pointed out when we talked over email a while ago, chapter 11, which talks about how to build APIs. Now, my understanding is that just on the here, but I may be wrong. Is there no good API support built into Django by itself, or this is like a kind of a quote unquote core feature done by the core team, but just not included by default because they feel it's not required?
No, so I guess it depends on how much you want to write for yourself, right? So an API really is just a matter of, I'm going to hit a URL and I want some data back. So Django, when you hit a URL, you map that to a running a function called a view. That view could return HTML. That view, for a standard web page, what it's going to do is it's going to call the template compiler, compile the HTML based on your pieces, and then it returns that back, and that renders the page in your browser. There are mechanisms, equivalent mechanisms, that instead of sending back the compiled HTML template, you can send back a JSON payload if you like. So if you want to do this by hand, you can write these views just like you write any other view, but instead of returning HTML for a page, you return JSON, and there's nothing stopping you from doing that in Django. Fast API came about, and they wrote a library that essentially made it relatively easy to do this. And so now there are third-party libraries out there that try to make this simpler to do in Django. So the core concept is there. The third-party libraries are essentially just give you more power tools to be able to do it. The granddaddy that's been around as a third party library for Django for a long time is the Django REST framework. And essentially, similar to the admin that I was talking about, it has mapping mechanisms. So you can say that thing in the database, I want most of it inside of this JSON payload, or I want all of it in the JSON payload, or whatever. So you've got this sort of a database to serialization kind of mechanism. And then it has ways of saying, I want a view or a view class to take that information out of the database and return it under this set of URLs. The Django REST framework is more or less payload agnostic. So it can be JSON if you're, a bit of a masochist. It could be YAML or whatever else you want. There are plugins to be able to change that. The Django REST framework it's been around for a while, and it tends to require a little more code. My current go-to library, which is, as you mentioned, chapter 11 in the book, spends a bunch of time talking about this, is a third-party library called Django Ninja. It uses decorators on the functions to map to the URLs, and it uses a Python library underneath called Pedantic that, again, is sort of a serialization library. So it takes very, very little code to go from that database object to your nested URLs, and it maps all of your HTTP CRUD methods. So full piece of the API that you can do puts and patches and all the rest of that kind of stuff, and then map those back to the serialization and right to the database. So yeah, like with anything, you could write this from scratch if you want. What the third party libraries do is gives you more power and mean you have less code to write and less code to maintain.
Yeah, that's basically what you want because there's a lot of stuff that's involved with this. I mean, you want to be able to also, I mean, a lot of times you want to start to lock down routes, right? Make sure this person
Yes.
is has a token and then
Yep.
has permission
Yep.
and lots of other things that could be involved with just those two. But those two alone is quite it's quite complicated. I didn't see
Yep.
far enough about how that's kind of done. Is that stuff pretty straightforward?
Yeah, so both Ninja and DRF both have flexible, pluggable authentication management mechanisms. In Ninja, you can do it per route, they've got a concept that they call a router, which is really just a group of routes, or you can do it at a configuration level that basically says through the entire API you have to do that. They have a class-based mechanism for determining what kind of authentication you're using. You can, if you want that to just be they have to have a token that's inside of a cookie, it can be that, or you've got it that it can be, it's sent up on each call. They've got interfaces. I think there's another third-party library that I've used which interfaces off with JavaScript GWT tokens. So there's a rich sort of set of choices for allowing you to manage all of that. And for the most part, it really is almost declarative, right? It's you put some 3 or 4 lines of code in that kind of act as configuration, and then after that you go. And you can also write your own class for that as well. So if you want to do some sort of custom token management piece, you can. It will integrate with Django's own user interface, so you can use like the username and passwords inside of the system. That works okay if your user is already authenticated. Like, if you're in the phone and you've got to have a username and password in the phone and you're going to use that system, then essentially you can use a Django session and then you don't have to deal with it at all. But if you're doing like a web-based API, that's generally not a good idea because then you have to send them to a web interface to log in, and then they get a token and then use that token for future API calls. So there's a lot of flexibility, and it really kind of depends on exactly where you're coming from and how you want to use it. But yeah, again, why these third-party libraries exist is to try and help you manage all of that and try to minimize the amount of code. And particularly, authentication and crypto is one of those things that they always frighten me. I don't want to write them. I want someone who is more familiar with the security space to do that for me, because it's one of those places where if you're not careful, you'll end up, you're pointing the revolver at your feet and you're missing toes.
Well, one of the other things that's also quite interesting too is that the Django is it Ninja Django or Django Ninja? It should be Django Ninja.
It's Django Ninja. Yeah,
Django Ninja. I got some. I forgot what that's called. Where you flipped it to.
that's okay. Well, and then there's Jinja, which is the template one. So yeah, it's
Let's not talk about that one yet.
yeah,
but
that's
because
everybody and their names. Welcome to the internet. Yes, but
and then
yes,
everybody's
Ninja.
got
Go
their own
on.
flavor of Jinja too. It's also Jinja TOO, but it's also called Jinja 2, number 2, right?
Yes.
Because I guess the first Jinja's now been
Yeah, you don't use that.
obsolete.
It
Yeah.
it's deprecated. Yes. Tangent.
But in any case, what I was gonna say was what else is really interesting and exciting and good is if you're building this API for, say, some outside consumers, from what I've seen in your chapter 11, it looks like Django Ninja already includes the documentation, a Swagger UI.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
Yeah. So,
exciting.
yeah. So that again, this is kind of that sort of that the same flavor as sort of that Django admin, right? Is people need a place to be able to muck with this kind of stuff, and so you can turn it on or off because for security reasons you might not want people to be able to play. But yeah, Ninja does come with a Swagger based interface, and so you essentially just hit. don't test me off the top of my head, but it's like slash doc after your API root, I think it is. And essentially, you get a full listing of the APIs that are available. There's buttons there for, putting your security token in, so the equivalent of authenticating. You can run any of the put patches, gets, posts, all that kind of good stuff, and get the results back, which, if nothing else, is a fantastic debugging interface. So you might turn it off in production, depending on your opinion about that. But as you mentioned, yeah, if it's a publicly available API, then this is really, really helpful to whoever's consuming your API, because it allows them to muck about and see how it works. So yeah, no, again, like the admin, this is one of those you get it for free kind of tools, and makes a big difference.
What I am kind of curious about though, I did see it's JSON, but I believe JSON API is some kind of standard in JSON, right? Does that get supported by Django Ninja or no?
I'm not clear on exactly where the boundaries of that are. So Ninja uses JSON as the output serializer by default. If I remember correctly, they do have a pluggable component for changing what the serialization mechanism is. I've never used it with Ninja. The DRF does have, like, the DRF comes with like 5 or 6 out of the box, and then there's another dozen third-party libraries that do it. The vast majority of folks that I talk to that are dealing with API pieces, they're just using vanilla JSON and go for it. So I I start there, and if you've got other needs, there are ways to muck with it if you have to. But the what comes out of the box is usually good enough.
I do use JSON, build some JSON APIs. I'm not a huge fan of that because I found that you get so much crap that comes in that you need to deal with. And so I'm a huge fan of GraphQL, the fact that it's all self kind of,
Yep.
I want to say self-deprecating, self-documenting, right? So
Yes.
that's also interesting too. I know you brought this up over email, and then also at the end of this chapter 11, you did start talking about it's called Graphene, I believe, is the name of the library.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a couple different libraries out there. I do mention graphene in the book. I've played with it a little bit. I've never put it into production, but essentially it's the same kind of concept. You use the library to map it to your ORM. These are the pieces that are going to be exposed inside of the GraphQL interface. These are the pieces that aren't. And then you register your routes, which actually for GraphQL, it's a single route, your reference point, and then it just turns it on. So you have to write some classes to say what is going to be queryable, what's mutable, and you can go from there. There's another library that I've only just sort of, I played with it for an hour to sort of validate that it was there. It was one of the we highlighted it on a version of the podcast. We always do a little bit of a, hey, here's libraries you might find interesting. So I've played with it just a tiny bit. It's called Strawberry, and it's graphene is very much like Django REST framework. It's a little older, and you need to write a little more code. Strawberry is very much like Ninja, that it uses decorators and some of the newer mechanisms for doing, but it's the same idea. You just essentially add a little bit of decoration to your code, add a couple views that are decorated, and then it maps it to GraphQL. So yeah, if GraphQL is your thing, there are definitely third-party libraries out there to be able to go. Yeah, for me, it's always that's always a matter of preference. We could debate the difference between whether GraphQL versus JSON. I find, for me personally, most of the time when I'm writing this stuff, I am both the consumer and the producer of the API, because I'm building the front end and the back end. And so I tend to be less worried about exactly what the interface is, as long as it's relatively easy for me to get the data to go back and forth. GraphQL, I think, is really, really powerful when you start trying to do more things like public APIs, because then other consumers, like you say, you've got some of that self-documenting and a little more of the control. Personally, I used to do a fair amount of Vue.js on my front end, and so there would be a lot of JSON flying back and forth. I now try to use HTMX as much as I can instead, which is a whole other tangent. But so when I was doing some of those API pieces, because I was both the producer and consumer, I always find, I defaulted to JSON, and it was good enough for what I was doing. But yeah, there are options out there for GraphQL, if that's the approach you want to take.
It's definitely something that I usually look at because especially the fact that you can kind of standardize what's coming in and it rejects it at the boundaries. I'm guessing that's what happens with graphene, but I know that's what happens with some others.
Yeah, well, if what you're after is the sort of the validation of this the JSON and making sure all of that's happening, tools like REST and Ninja will do that for you on the JSON side because there's a serialization step. That serialization step then maps to the actual ORM before you start doing things with the objects. So if as an example, so JavaScript only has a concept of number, right? When so everything technically is a double. So, but on your server side, if that's something that's supposed to be an integer, you can put in code that says, hey, when you're serializing this is how I want to handle that. I want to reject it outright or I want to do whatever. So, as part of that serialization process, you can get validation of the JSON. So, it really just becomes a matter of, at what stage in the interface do you want to do that validation? And if you do it at the serialization stage, then, you can send back a 403 or whatever, and you can get into a place where you're not, if the data is not allowed, it can be handled by these frameworks. So yeah, so it really is just a where do you want to deal with the problem kind of question.
Okay. Now that we kind of talked a little bit about, how to actually add the APIs, is there any kind of tips that you would give to people who are kind of wanting to start build the API to their Django app? Because I mean, we talked about, straight up just vanilla JSON as we call it. There's JSON API, which we kind of hinted at. We don't have to talk about that one, but we got graphene. I mean, how would you kind of coach somebody? Like, what's the first step? What's the second step? And somebody could even be like, well, first think about, something like this. How would you kind of coach somebody through this who's doing this for the first time?
I think uh, fundamentally, it's almost always comes down to before you're even thinking about the API is what is your database. The vast majority of the time, what your API is doing is exposing stuff that's inside of the database, and a lot of these third party tools map that. And so, if your database is organized in a reasonable fashion, that mapping tends to be relatively simple. And otherwise, you end up in a place where you might be fighting the tools a little bit. And so I think there's like, from a computer science perspective, there's that core concept of, am I thinking about the data in my system? Am I thinking about how the objects interact correctly? And if you've got that correct, you're by the time you get to the API, you're probably already there because it just tends to flow relatively nicely out of that. Where you'll run into challenges is, when you're trying to expose data, an API on, say, data structures that have already been decided by somebody else, right? So, like if you're supposed to be building an API to someone else's database inside of an organization, then you've got to sort of do that mapping translation piece, and then you're sort of going through a similar kind of exercise to what I was talking about, but you're thinking about it from the consumer perspective of what data makes sense to them. How am I going to do that? What does the structure of that look like? If you're doing REST, which if you're doing Ninja or DRF, then that's probably your approach. Then you're trying to figure out, what your nouns and your verbs are. For something like GraphQL, you're going through the same process. You're just calling them different things, but you're trying to figure out, what objects are coming back, what things can I do on those objects, right? So that's the conceptual part that you kind of have to get down pat. The structure of the API tends to come out of that rather naturally after that. For REST in particular, there are some rules of thumb about how REST is this standard that's a non-standard. The amount of flexibility there means you can do pretty much anything you want. You can use post to retrieve things. You shouldn't, but you can. And so then you get into sort of that conversation about best practices. So if you've never done it before, I would definitely suggest going and doing a little bit of reading on what it looks like to have a good REST interface, what your nouns are, what your verbs are, and try to make sure that the URLs and the routes that you come up with for your APIs make sense within that context. If you're the only consumer of it, it doesn't really matter. But eventually some other programmer might have to look at it. And as a result, sticking with some of those best practices can be helpful. As an example, we go back to that person that I was talking about. Inside of REST, the typical way of having it is there's usually like a root inside of the API. So /person. And then if I'm editing that person, it would be /person/35 if it was person ID 35, right? So learning a little bit about how the usual ways of doing REST to structure that is useful just from a maintainability standpoint. You don't have to do it that way. REST doesn't really care. But for the sake of other coders who might have to touch your code, it's far more understandable if you stick with some of the unwritten rules that most REST programmers try to follow.
I mean, what about when you thought about it, you designed your APIs, you know what you need. Over time things change. You got to add more features, maybe things take it away. Versioning your API, or how would you kind of handle this stuff, and how do you start to deprecate things? Do you have any recommendations about this, and what's an easy way to handle this?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of versioned APIs. I've been yelled at about my opinion on this before. Some people seem to have very strong opinions on this. I tend to just go with the very old school of put the version number inside of the API itself. So it's API slash v1 slash then my version. I know there are folks out there who insist it must be in a header. I've never understood the argument one way or the other, and so I just kind of stick my head in the sand and go. The concept for those who haven't dealt with this before, the idea behind a versioned API is you want to try to make sure that breaking changes are things that are understood by the people who are consuming your API. Putting version number information inside the API allows you to make a breaking change, and if you need to make a breaking change, you change that version number. So you can, generally speaking, you can add features as long as the edits don't change. So what I mean by that, so if we go back to my person example, if I want to add a field to person, that isn't going to break the old API. Someone still consume slash person, and it's by having an extra field there isn't going to break their interface. But if I want to rename person to, I don't know, alien, and I've changed the API together, then anyone who was consuming person before isn't going to see alien and it's going to break. So then I want to change the version number inside of the API. If you're writing both the front end and the back end for these things, it's not that big a deal. If you're writing something that's publicly consumable, then this is a big deal. And this doesn't necessarily mean you end up duplicating your code. There are ways, if you're writing these version interfaces, to sort of map them on the back end. And essentially what you end up doing is inside of your API calls is you say, oh, if it's version one, then, the alien gets remapped to the name person. And then you have to maintain the old version for a little while. You can deprecate it, but that gives your consumers time to catch up. And how much time you give them to catch up depends on who your audience is, right? So if it's an internal product inside of an organization, it might be, hey guys, we're breaking this. You've got 2 months to catch up. If you're somebody like Facebook and you've written a platform where there are games on top of it, it might be, hey guys, you've got 18 months to fix this, because it takes time for folks to catch up on those things. But that becomes more of a business decision once you've got the technology of being able to put the version number in the API.
Okay, well, those are some very good tips. Is there anything that we think that we didn't touch on? Because I feel like we've covered most of all of our bases, and a little bit of background about what it is, etc. Is there any kind of parting thoughts you have on your side before we head off?
There's a lot of information out there on, one of the advantages of going to an older library. Django's over 20 years old. The disadvantage is there's 20 years of cruft in there. The advantage of that is there's all sorts of documentation. There's all sorts of great books and online courses, and even Django's own website, djangoproject.com, has a lot of fantastic tutorials and things out there. One of the advantages of picking up something that's big and popular like that is there's plenty of resources out there to try to learn it. I find both the Django and the Python community, there's always exceptions to everything, but they tend to be fairly welcoming, and there's lots of great places to ask both newbie questions and hardcore questions and get all sorts of help. So it's if it's something you're thinking about, it's a relatively friendly pool to dive into.
All right. And with that, again, thanks for coming on and talking more about Django and why we should definitely have a look at it, and also when we start actually using it, hopefully, how to actually add the API once we need to start adding in a Flutter component to that, or Flutter client.
For sure.
Again, yeah, thanks for coming on, and hopefully have you again back on in the future.
I
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you.